Visit atwsource.com to take the next step along your path of awakening. You're listening to Awakening Truth, worldwide radio, and its network of radio shows, presented by the teachers of Awakening Truth Worldwide, where spirituality, truth, and consciousness collide.
Welcome to A Guiding Light. I'm Dr. Joseph Marra, and my co-host tonight is Vanessa Da Silva. We would first like to wish all of those fathers out there a happy Father's Day. Tonight, we'll be joined by our special guest, Thomas Fusco. Thomas will be discussing questions such as, do we live in a holographic reality? Are there multiple dimensions within this universe? Could defining these things help explain what we consider the paranormal experience? Tune in as we discuss the possibility. Thomas Fusco, welcome to A Guiding Light.
Well, hi, Dr. Marra. How are you doing?
I'm doing great.
Great.
Are you a father?
I've got a few cats.
Well, then, happy Father's Day.
I always say that I have no children, but my wife has one.
Got it. That's a good one. Okay, so could you describe for our listeners how you became aware of this current understanding that you currently have, and or a brief history of your life's work?
Well, you know, I was one of these children that had an insatiable curiosity. I always had to understand why, the reasons behind anything. And, you know, for me, understanding the whys and the wherefores were fundamental to what action I was going to take. Even when I was being asked to do something, I needed to know why. And, you know, in my teen years and early 20s, I actually had several kind of profound supernatural, or you might call parapsychological experiences that really caused me to call into question the model of the universe that I was taught in physics. And so for me, the compelling question became, what kind of universe could allow these things to happen? How was the universe put together in order to accommodate the type of events and observations that we consider paranormal or supernatural? And so those very observations were an indication to me that the model of the universe that I was taught in physics was not complete, or there was something missing or flawed in it. And so that set me off into many years of research, coming up with a different paradigm and a new cosmological framework into which all observations, normal or paranormal, would be able to be accommodated.
Right. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that question, why, that you started off with, got me in a lot of trouble growing up as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I got in trouble all the time. But what really got me in trouble was the fact that I knew when I was getting my leg pulled.
Oh, yeah.
And that was where it was really bad.
Yeah.
You know, so
yeah.
But I made it through it. It taught me at a very early age not to just simply lay down and trust the establishment.
Yeah.
I taught that the vast majority of people who were wanting me to do a certain thing in a certain way was entirely for their own profit and benefit and not for mine.
Mm-hmm.
And taught me that there are times where I should keep my mouth shut.
Yeah. Trust me, I know all about all that. I'm sitting here thinking of the parallels here, what you're saying. So to dig here.
Being a childhood genius is a very, very lonely place to be.
Well, I wouldn't call myself a genius because I'm going to get slapped here if I do. So.
Well, it's one of the things that I say. It's like, you know, and it's a dirty word. But the reason why it's a dirty word is that, you know, one person might be able to say, hey, you know, I'm an incredible tennis player. Here's my trophies, this and that. Or I'm an incredible chess player. Or I'm, you know, this or that or the other thing, Olympic swimmer, whatever. And most people can accommodate that because they can simply stand up and say that, well, I'm not a swimmer. I'm not a tennis player. I'm not a chess player. So it doesn't cost me anything to, you know, have this person report that they have these kinds of capabilities. Big, you know, it's great, no problem. Unfortunately, this doesn't work when you have a very high IQ because everyone has a brain, so everyone's offended by it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, let's dig in here a little bit, and maybe you could tell the listeners, I guess we started off the show with a couple questions that I was hoping we could get into, and I'm sure that it would be easy for you to maybe get into. And basically, do we live in a holographic reality?
Well, in the holographic reality, as per, you know, a la David Bohm, you know, specifically, you know, I've heard that term tossed around a few times, and it's meant something different for different people.
Yeah.
You know, I wouldn't say that I fully agree with that particular, you know, model of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
However, if we are talking about a Bohmian model of reality, like I said, as per physicist David Bohm, one of the most prominent physicists of the 20th century, I've definitely come to the conclusion that he was right on when he was discussing what he called implicate order, which was a body of information, a pattern, a set of laws, order, principles that existed above and outside of space-time. But that order actually gave rise to what he called explicate order, which was the physical world of time, space, matter, and energy. And so I've come to the conclusion that there's no other explanation for the improbable order that the physical universe has.
Okay. So you mentioned earlier about these events that impacted your life. Could you go into that, maybe some of what people would call paranormal that you experienced in order to personally experience these things, and then how it led you down a path of new awareness, so to speak?
Well, I mean, most people that have gone into these kind of, you know, unusual fields of study have had experiences that they couldn't explain according to, you know, the mainstream, you know, science, so to speak, the mainstream model of what reality is. So, you know, I'm no different in that. As far as discussing the specifics about those particular experiences, I don't really discuss those on the radio. What I want people to do if they're going to assess, you know, what I have to say, I want them to assess it on the merits of my work, not on whether, you know, what they think about any particular experience that I had.
Okay, but maybe you could define maybe a paranormal experience. Was it like a ghost that you saw, or was it a UFO, or just to give the listener some kind of idea where you're coming from as far as an experience?
Well, if anyone has had something that they would call a paranormal or supernatural experience, that would be those kinds of experiences.
Okay.
But like I also already said, Dr. Marra, I don't get into the details of it on radio interviews.
Right.
So I don't mean to sound abrupt, but
yeah.
I'd much rather talk about my work.
Right. Well, let's dig into it. maybe you could, maybe dig in a little bit and tell us a little bit so I can, form some, questions for you.
Well, I think that the first thing that I should talk about is some of the foundational concepts of my particular work and the theories that are, that are brought out from it. One of the things I came to an understanding early on is that we needed to have a scientifically relevant and meaningful definition for what people would call supernatural or paranormal. This is a very important body of evidence, and I'll explain in a little bit why it is so important. But to start out with, paranormal is a kind of a term that has traditionally served as kind of a catch-all basket, that anybody or anything that was weird or odd or unusual would get tossed into this category called the paranormal. And, of course, that's not something that you can really, stick a stake in the ground and begin to reckon with it. So after careful consideration, I came to a definition that what constitutes paranormal is any physical effect that is physically observable, that interacts with its environment. Of course, if it didn't act with its environment, it wouldn't be observable, but has no direct physical cause locally connected to it. It's what physicists call non-locality or non-local causality. And to give an example, if we talk about the difference between a normal voice and a paranormal voice, let's say like a disembodied voice, the effect is a compression, a wave compression through the air, that we have the air vibrates with a frequency and an amplitude, and that compression wave reaches our eardrums, or it might reach a device that we've designed like a recorder, reach its microphone, and then those vibrations are translated by the accompanying electronics, either the electronics in the recorder or the electronics in our brain, into sound. That's a normal effect. It's a physical effect. But a normal voice, there's a cause, a physical cause locally connected to the effect, and that is our vocal cords. Our vocal cords are the cause that's directly connected to the air column that vibrates according to those vocal cords. In a paranormal voice, like a disembodied voice, the effect is the same, but there's no physical cause locally connected to the effect of the air molecules vibrating. And so to me, a physical effect with no direct physical cause connected to it is what constitutes paranormal phenomena.
Okay. So going down this path, so say it's considered paranormal within the definition, and it's non-local. Is it coming from another dimension? Where would you, in your work, what have you come up with where it does come from?
Well, this is a very important question, and this comes to one of the paradigms that my work introduces, because there's a lot of different ways that we can look at something, even the universe itself. What I liken it to is, I say, imagine that we discovered the Great Pyramid of Giza and two other conditions. Let's say the entire structure and all of its stones were completely disassembled. They were scattered all over the ground, all over the place. And furthermore, that there were no other pyramids in the world by which we could get an idea what the structure originally was. How would we put it together? Every single one of those stones, standing on those stones, would give a completely different perspective of the field of components, of elements that we would have around us. Each stone would give you a different viewpoint, of what's in front of you. But if you found the capstone, that perspective is the accurate one. That is the one perspective from which you can begin to piece together the entire structure in an easy and sensible way. And so for me, looking at the universe is the same kind of a challenge, to find that particular perspective that is superior to all the other ones in uncovering what is before us, what we observe. And so for me, that paradigm ultimately became an idea that the universe is an expression of materialized and materializing information. Now, the idea of information being a fundamental constituent of physical reality is something that's been wholly embraced by physics over the last couple decades, particularly in the computer age. So much so that physics has actually come up with an extension to the conservation laws that we were taught years ago in school, that matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed. In recent decades, physics has added the idea that information can neither be created nor destroyed either. So they've added an extension to those conservation laws. But they normally don't look at it in terms of materialization, because physics works under a fundamental philosophy that the universe is self-determining and self-explaining. Or in other words, every physical effect in the universe must have a physical material cause contained in the same universe. Now, I extend that. I say that there must be more than what is in the physical universe in terms of information. Because, again, in recent decades, our powers of observation have grown so much in physics and science that we have finally, for the first time in history, have reached a place where we have more physical observations than we have physical material to explain them. We have literally run out of physical causes for all of the effects that we observe. And so for me, that's very strong evidence of David Bohm's concept that the information that is resulting in these observations where we have no physical cause for them that we can detect is actually coming from outside of space-time. And so consequently, we have a situation where that information has to materialize. And then that materialization is in the results in the forms and structures that we see in the universe. And so for me, the universe is an expression of materialized and materializing information. And once we begin to look at it that way, we are able to start looking at things like paranormal events in a whole new way.
So do you feel that human beings, through their thought, that they can manifest such a thing?
Well, now let's take a look at that. That's a very interesting question. And that has been talked about in a lot of different ways, as you know. That's been speculative, philosophical, hypothetical, metaphysical. We've seen all these kinds of ideas. But for me, I have to give some sort of a scientific foundation to it. Otherwise, I wander in that same area that we've pretty much kind of been, like Ellen Guiley says, wash, rinse, and repeat. And that's pretty much what we've been doing. But for me, the way I look at it is this. I want to apply to the universe a principle that is very common in physics, and that is describing and analyzing systems. Now, a system is established by and defined by and governed by a set of laws and principles. Although we may not fully understand them all, we understand that there's a given set of laws and principles that govern a system, how it's assembled and how it works. Now, furthermore, any subsystem, any emergent subsystem from that greater system cannot operate in a way that's contrary to or outside of the laws and principles that govern the greater system in which it's a part. So, an example, let's say we have a deck of 52 playing cards, and that's our starting system. And we have 52 cards, 4 suits, 13 face values per suit. And those are the laws and principles that govern the system. We can make up an almost infinite number of games with all different kinds of rules to play with those cards. We can deal out a dizzying different array of hands and different combinations of cards that we can come up with. But in the end, any game that we make up and any hand that we could deal has to be in accordance with the laws and principles that govern the greater system in which those games and hands are a part. In other words, you're not going to develop a game where suddenly from your deck of cards you're going to be dealing out a fifth suit. It magically appears like a suit of swords or Chevys or whatever you'd want to pick up. You know, the initial system has clubs, diamonds, hearts, and spades. That's it. Now, let's expand that and take a look at the universe. The universe is such a system. It is the main system. And even though we don't fully understand all the laws and principles that govern it, we do know enough now to know that there is a standard set of laws and principles that govern this universe, and they work the same way everywhere in the universe. This was something that was speculated years before, that maybe the laws of physics are different in different parts of the universe, and we've pretty much eliminated that idea. That means that every subsystem in the universe has to behave in accordance with the laws and principles that govern the greater universe. And I know this is a lengthy definition, but Dr. Marra, if this was easy, we would have read it in an Archie comic book about 30 years ago.
No, I understand. I mean, there's one of the things that as you're talking, I'm thinking, I'm sure that there are, and I'm aware that there are universal laws that govern certain things. And however, with our limitation and the way we can perceive things, because we have 5 senses that we can perceive with, and just because we can't perceive it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I mean, microscopes came out, and then now all of a sudden, you can see bacteria or viruses, and the same with the telescope. We couldn't see so far out there, but now we can see really far because of Hubble's telescope. I mean, billions of light years. So, some of the things that we're discussing tonight, I'm just wondering how many laws that we just don't know that exist that are out there because of the limitation in our perception.
Absolutely. Now, here's the thing, which has helped us out a lot. This principle that I'm talking about allows us to understand a lot about the universe, because we cannot analyze the universe as this one giant mouthful, so to speak, at once. What we do is analyze the universe's subsystems. And from those subsystems, we can derive the laws and principles that we know govern the universe at large, because all of those laws are manifested in all of its subsystems. Now, unfortunately, in physics, we have a tendency not to want to go in certain areas, like, say, psychology, for example. Physics will run away from that and say, excuse me, and say, no, we're not going there, that's not our domain. And I, on the other hand, will take a physicist and grab him by the scruff of the shirt and drag him kicking and screaming over there and saying, well, wait a minute. Is not physics the study of what is physical? Is not the human brain physical? So consequently, by a physicist saying that the human brain is outside of his realm of study is a hypocrite, because the human brain is indeed physical. and it is also a subset of the greater universe. Therefore, if the human brain is a subset of the greater universe, that means that the laws and principles that govern it cannot operate in a way that's contrary to or outside of the laws that govern the greater universe in which it is a component. Now that we've come to that point, we can begin to answer your question. Let us take a look at the human brain and see what it does. Well, the first thing the human brain is it's alive. It's part of a living creature. The second thing that we see about the human brain is it's intelligent. We recognize patterns and can make deductions and conclusions on those patterns that animals, they don't even have a chance. They can't even get into the game. Human beings are very unique in that. And the third thing is that we're creative. And what's our creative process like? Exactly what I talked about with the paradigm of the universe, that we are able to take invisible information and materialize it into physical reality. So our brain works the exact same way as the universe does. Therefore, since our brains are intelligent, they are alive, and that they create, they transform information into a materialized equivalent in the physical world, just like the telephone I'm talking on. That means that all those principles are contained and built into the laws and principles of the greater universe. Otherwise, a physicist would have to argue that the human or that the physical universe created a subset of itself in the form of a human brain that operates in a way that's outside of or contrary to the laws that govern the greater universe. So, if the universe was a true creation out of nothing, and that creative capacity is built into its laws and principles and is transferred into the human brain by the very evidence that we create materializations that didn't exist before our information was materialized through our hands, then that means that, yes, we do have the power to make things come into reality, to materialize them.
Right. Okay. We're about halfway around the clock here, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about your book. And maybe you could tell the listeners what they can expect and where they can find it.
My book, Behind a Cosmic Veil, is available on my website. There's links to where you can buy it in various places, along with a description of the book, sample chapters, my blog, related articles. All that can be found at www.cosmicveil, that's spelled V-E-I-L, cosmicveil.com.
Great. Okay. And do you mind if we open up the lines for callers if anybody has questions? Do you do that?
Oh, yes. That's very fascinating.
Okay, great. So if there's anybody out there that has any questions for Mr. Fusco, please call in at 323-679-0927, and we'll continue the discussion until we get some calls.
There we go.
All right. As far as, I make this comment all the time, thought becomes reality, and we can manifest it. I think we're limited to the, of course, what we've been trained all our lives, and some of this, if you get into the metaphysical and some of the other research that I've gotten into, it just seems like what you said earlier, within the educational system, it's not exactly what you come up with when you do your own research. And I think some of that is because the information is out there, but we're not presented with it, at least not in traditional education or traditional medicine. So I think that there's a controlling, factor going on this planet at this time. But to go back, I think that we are much more than what we've ever been taught or told, and the sky's the limit, but we just don't know it. And we think we can't do certain things. It's just because we've been taught that way. And we're like these little worker bees or these dumb people that don't know anything. And how would you reply to that?
I would reply to that in a couple different ways. Science has an agenda, and that agenda is the pure study of physical reality. But science is maintained and conducted and administered by scientists. Scientists are human beings, and human beings have their own agenda, which is not necessarily the same as the agenda of the discipline of science.
Right.
So, of course, one of the things that mainstream science wants to convey to the general public, because it's good for their image, is that they have become masters of all that they have surveyed. And everything that they pronounce, or that is pronounced by their own particular priesthood, is Scripture. The reality of it is much different than that. And they themselves know that the reality is much different than that. The other aspect of it, Doctor, is that we really are laboring under false paradigms in some instances. And to explain to people what that means, I kind of refer to the in ancient times, several thousand years ago, where what dominated Western civilization, the cosmology that dominated Western civilization, was the Aristotelian model of Aristotle, where he conceived of all the planets and the stars being embedded in these large crystalline spheres that rotated around a fixed Earth. And it was much more complicated than that, but when people looked up into the sky with that paradigm, that's what they saw. Now, we look up today with our paradigm, our modern 21st century paradigm, of what the universe is, and we see something very, very, very different than what the ancients did. And yet, the same information coming to us from the light waves, from all of these heavenly objects, the exact same information is entering our minds or our eyes and going to our brains as it did several thousand years ago. It's just that we have completely different paradigms than they did then. So some of the phenomena that you're talking about with education has to do with this, this desire of mainstream science to make themselves look, as flawless as possible. And some of it has to do with false paradigms, with things that they embrace and that we're taught that are not reality. They're defective.
Yeah, some of the other things that just popped into my head while you're talking there is, a lot of the scientists that I've come in contact with want the reproducible studies and all these types of things, and some of which haven't had these experiences, these what we call paranormal experiences, whether they've seen ghosts or UFOs or whatever. So, our model today in education, at least scientifically, is the scientific method, which has to be reproducible. And in many cases, we didn't even have the tools to pick up on some of this phenomenon until recently. And then even some of the things we have today, they don't value as valid.
Well, here's the dishonesty, the insincerity in that kind of a position. First of all, when we're talking about something that can be reproducible, we don't study it because it's reproducible. Oh, I'm sorry, excuse me. Do you study sunspots?
Right.
Mr. Astrophysicist, do you study solar flares? Are they always there? Can you reproduce them on demand?
Right.
Oh, you can't? I'm sorry. Well, please explain to me the difference. Oh, I see that when you look at the sun, you know that if you study that particular object, at some point in time you're going to get sunspots and solar flares to study. Oh, I get it. It's just like a haunted house. If you hang around one of those haunted sites long enough, you'll get phenomena rise up on a regular basis to study too. I get it. I don't let them play games with me because I know where they live, and they know that I know where they live in a sense, mentally. You know, and sometimes people think I come off a bit arrogant, but you got to be tough. You have to be a fighter, but you have to be armed with the information that you need to fight. And this is where the problem is. You have psychologists and doctors and parapsychologists studying these fields of parapsychology and that kind of phenomena, but very few of them have a background or a doctorate in physics. So they're studying a physical construction, and they don't fully understand the physics of it. And the physicist that does understand it is scared to death to go into that arena because they're going to get themselves in big trouble. They're not going to be able to maintain this image. All we got to do is put it in a test tube, and voila, we can figure out what it is and show you. So this is one of the problems. It's like what Dr. Barry Taft says, who's a researcher in the paranormal for a long time, when he's asked what's the single most best piece of advice that he feels he could give to paranormal and supernatural investigators, he says, get an education. Learn how you see things. Learn the idea that it's photons that are reaching your eyes, which is how you see something. Learn why the sky looks blue. Learn that there's so many different gases in the air. Learn that the grass is green because of the chlorophyll and what it does. Learn basic physics. And then you can actually begin to start understanding what you see.
Right. Okay, so since you mentioned education, maybe you could tell the listeners maybe your educational background or what you've been doing for a living or what you currently do.
Well, once again, this comes into the same category as with my personal experiences. I want all the judgment and all the opinions to be based upon my work, not upon my titles. Everybody in the UFO community, and everybody's heard of Dr. Stanton Friedman. I'm sure you have too.
Yeah.
He's a doctorate in physics. He's very much, they call him the grandfather of ufology. What I ask people, could you give me an example of one individual anywhere on the face of the earth here that now believes in UFOs just because Dr. Stanton Friedman says they exist?
Right.
His degree means nothing. His work, you have to judge what the substance of it on the merits of the work. And again, because of the revolutionary nature of my work, because there are certain factions, like the fanatically atheistic in the field of physics, that very much dislike what I do. And there's other factions that do too. The majority of people, thank God, are very receptive to it. I'm not going to give them fuel for the fire.
Okay, that's fair. So
analyze my work. Judge my work on its own merits. Say I just dropped dead. I burned up in a fire, and every recording about any record about my personal life has just been destroyed. My book's still out there. Read it and form an opinion.
Okay, that's fair enough. The work we're discussing here then, is it like years and years of your own personal research, like your work that we're discussing? And then the cosmic veil, what does that mean? Or what can the listeners expect to find within your book? Just maybe a couple teasers so they know what they're purchasing.
Well, I do, obviously, in the 21st century here, I'm in a very good position where I can stand on the shoulders of giants. For example, I have available to me the work of Newton, the work of Maxwell, the work of Einstein, the work of Oppenheimer, and Bohm, who I mentioned earlier. I have that work in front of me. So, yes, all of that has gone into my work, and I've proceeded past those things, using their information as a jumping board, so to speak. In fact, my theory is very much an extension of the Einsteinian model of a continuous field of the universe. It really is very Einsteinian in its makeup. But, what they can expect to find is answers, is a coherent concept, not math, but a visualization of a picture of reality that suddenly makes all kinds of things fall into place and make a lot of these mysteries suddenly make sense. And that's what I mean by behind the cosmic veil, that we're actually peeling back the veil that has been clouding our understanding to see more clearly what's going on. Furthermore, what you will find is something that's unique in this kind of field, and I've been told it's the first time this has come along. This is not a philosophical speculation. It's not a metaphysical thesis. It's not any of those things. It is a scientific theory. And what distinguishes a scientific theory from any other kind of theorizing is that it makes specific predictions about the nature of reality that are experimentally testable. And so this is part of my work, too. And, in fact, some of those experiments have already been conducted, and some aspects of my model has already been verified scientifically.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So one of the things we didn't get into, you did mention Einstein and Newton and some others. What about the more recent things like string theory? Have you studied that, or have you researched it? Is it in your book at all? Or what do you know about string theory?
Well, here's what we have with string theory. And a lot of people are not aware of this, but I'll give a little bit of a background. Einstein's vision of the universe, his vision of reality, which he was never able to demonstrate in its entirety mathematically through his unification theory, because he wasn't able to express gravity mathematically through 4 dimensions. No one has actually been able to do that. But what he did say was that the space and time, the fabric of space and time, is a field, and that field is defined by 4 individual variables: height, width, depth, and time. And so he said that in that field we would have areas of greater concentration, and that concentration would be called matter points. They would constitute what he called the physical components of the universe. Now, this is where he developed the idea of bent space, because he said that space would bend at these areas, these matter points, the physical constituents in the universe. Now, here's the thing. He said that gravity was a function of this bending of space. But traditionally in physics, we have looked at gravity as a conventional force. And one of the things that's necessary for a conventional force, this is one of the false paradigms that we were taught in school. Everybody who's listening to me believed that they were taught about gravity in school. That's false. You were not taught about gravity in school. You were taught all about gravitational effect. But you were not taught about gravity because we don't know what gravity is. So if it's a conventional force, and this has been the traditional view, a force has to comprise of a particle that propagates itself as a wave. And so in electromagnetism, we have an electron that propagates as an electromagnetic field. But gravity, in order to be a force, is dependent upon the theoretical existence of a hypothetical particle known as a graviton. And we have searched for decades for this graviton, and we've not been able to find it. Now, of course, science, working under its paradigm of materialism, believes through a religious faith in that paradigm that a graviton must exist. But we have no evidence that it does. So this is what I'm leading up to answer your question, because, again, none of these things are simple. And anybody gives you a 25-word or less explanation for something, they're pretty much probably pulling your leg and seeing to try to take advantage of a lack of understanding. Oh, that answer sounded good. But as far as a graviton is concerned, I look at the Einsteinian model, and based on that, gravity is a result of the compression of space into a concentration in certain areas that bend it and create pockets. Therefore, there is no such thing as a graviton. So my model predicts there's no such thing as a graviton. And now I can answer the question. My opinion of string theory, M theory, supersymmetry, and all of these incredibly convoluted theories that Einstein would say that they were unnecessarily complex. Without a graviton, they all dissolve. You take out the graviton and string theory is gone. Take out the graviton and superstring theory is gone. M theory is gone. Supersymmetry is gone. They're all gone. They can't stand without the graviton. So that's my opinion, that there is no such thing as a graviton. That's why we can't find it. And subsequently, there is no such validity. There's no validity in string theory.
Okay, that's fair enough. Wait, I knew this was going to get deep, this conversation here. And I'm just trying to find ways that, while we're waiting for callers to call in, to pick your brain, so to speak, in various avenues. And one of the things that popped into my head earlier was something that you hear in the paranormal studies. Sometimes there's a loop, so to speak, of energy when they're investigating a haunted house, and they feel that it's an energy that's just kind of lingering right there. And then on the flip side of it is it's a actual haunting, like it's a ghost in the astral realm that's actually there at that particular time. It's not a feedback loop, so to speak. And how would that fit into what you just said about your theories and behind the cosmic veil?
According to my model, I have made an extension of Kaluza-Klein theory. And Theodore Kaluza, we were talking a minute earlier about Einstein being unable to ultimately create a mathematical proof for his unified field theory because he wasn't able to express gravity mathematically through 4 dimensions. Theodore Kaluza was a mathematician and a physical theorist of the 20th century, and he was contemporary with Einstein, and he was working on this same kind of problem, alongside of Einstein. But what he came up with one day, he said, hey, why don't we try putting into this equation a 5th dimension, a 5th coordinate. It's not physical. It's not anything that's represented in the physical universe. It's something that's outside of the physical universe. But let's give it a coordinate and a numerical value and put it in the equation and try it this way. So he did that. He tried it. He added this 5th extra physical coordinate and worked Einstein's equations. And, of course, at the very end, he would have to subtract it out because what he would have to have left is only the 4 dimensions of physical space-time. And he did that, and lo and behold, he was the only human being that ever balanced Einstein's unified field equation by using a 5th coordinate outside of space-time. Subsequently, he came to the conclusion later in his years that gravity, or the bending of space, was a super or extra physical effect. It was non-local. In other words, it was an effect that we observed. It has no local physical cause, that the cause of it was actually originating outside of the normal four-dimensional space-time. This would actually be very consistent with David Bohm's implicate order, and also the implications of Einstein's continuous spatial field, where everything is the same part of the same field. Every piece of matter and energy is all part of the continuous spatial field. So now, if that's the case, let's assume that we're seeing a real-time materialization in a haunted house. Remember I said earlier about the universe being an expression of materialized and materializing information. Most of the structures that we see in the universe are very stable. The only time we normally see spontaneous materialization in a laboratory setting is with a particle accelerator, like the one that they're running now in Europe, the CERN, the Hadron Collider. But in a haunted house, we see in real time materializations and dematerializations of specific, coherent, ordered, recognizable information. Now, this gives us an idea that what is going on in a haunted house has something to do with the way information from originating outside of local space actually contributes to the materialization of the universe itself. We're seeing something happen in real time. So, again, and I apologize, Dr. Marra, because there are no simple answers to these very deep questions that you're asking.
Mm-hmm.
You have to give the background first, that new paradigm, and then you can go and explain this. Otherwise, I'm no better than 1,000 others that you've interviewed that have just said the same things with different words, and you know exactly what I mean.
Yeah, it's important that you're given the backstory behind all this. I understand. And I'm just trying to use on the radio some of your theory and your knowledge to question some of the things that people are physically seeing. And a lot of the people I interview have various theories of their own. And some of these extraterrestrial or star family beings that are coming from these higher dimensions, the fourth, fifth, higher fourth, I guess is what they say, or fifth and higher. And I'm just trying to help paint a picture of how it is possible that this is actually occurring, because people, and thousands of people, are claiming to see UFOs. I've seen some myself. I don't know what they were, but I had similar experiences as other people, and when I did see them, it wasn't just that I saw them. I had a personal connection, and there's a euphoric feeling when you do see these types of things. So typically, like the general population, and they just don't see them, or at least they hadn't up until recently. Now, it's more and more people are either coming out and talking about them, or it's just they're being seen by more people right now. I don't know what the actual reasoning behind it is, but maybe you could explain that, like as far as like how would it be possible, theoretically speaking, as far as a UFO? Is it a similar thing as a ghostly figure? Would they phase out of one dimension? You talked about the fifth dimension. Would they phase from a higher dimension down, or how would you explain that?
Well, those are good questions, Dr. Marra, and that's exactly what we're talking about, and that's exactly what I'm leading up to with this explanation. Because here's the thing, as you've said, you've spoke to a lot of people. There's a lot of people that have different theories about these things. But the problem with all of these theories that have been floating around is they're not scientific theories. They don't make specific predictions about certain aspects of reality that one could design an experiment from and conduct it and test it. So there's a lot of theories, but there's not a lot of scientific theories. So, but as far as the other thing that you mentioned about people experiencing these things, absolutely. What does it matter whether 10% of the population experiences them, or 20% witness them, or 3% witness them? You know, how many human beings on the face of the earth have actually witnessed their own physical foot being placed on the soil of the moon? Maybe a dozen? I forget. Can't be more than 20 astronauts that went to the moon. Just because we have a very tiny percentage of people who've witnessed something firsthand doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So I accept that body of witness, that information, that some of them have to be genuine events. I don't question any of that at all. Sometimes people hear me and they say, well, gee, he doesn't believe in this and that. It's actually not true. I just don't believe in the conventional explanation sometimes for them. But if we can get back, I'll get back to what we were talking about here. If I've been able to explain it correctly, we have two elements here now. We have information that the universe is materialized from, but is originating from outside of space-time. That's one thing. Number two, we have an environmental condition being created also outside of space-time, or from outside of space-time into our local space, and that is the bending of space. So if we combine these two, under the paradigm of materializing information, we find that information could drop down below the speed of light into a pocket of space-time that would allow a subluminal materialization of information coming into it below the speed of light. That pocket would allow us to do that. And then that information would materialize in that pocket. Now, what does that have to do with a haunted house and the things that people see? Let's take an example. Let's take a look at this. Imagine in a haunted house or inside of a building, we have a bubble of space-time that expands. I tell people, imagine the fabric of space-time being like the surface of an old rubber inner tube, and it's got a weak spot in it. So when you fill it up with air, a balloon pops out of that weak spot, like an old 20s movie gag or something, or somebody blowing a balloon up. Imagine if a bubble of space-time expanded inside of a haunted house. What would we see? Well, Einstein proved to us. He said that when space bends, it will crush and compress the surrounding spatial field around that bend. And, of course, he proved to us that during that solar eclipse, where they were able to see the starlight adjacent to the solar disk, that he was able to predict that starlight would be deviated 1.75 degrees from this spatial compression on the outside of this bend. But we're out there, we're talking about a vacuum, relatively. In a haunted house, we have material. We have air, for example. Let's say it's happening in midair. And that crushed space around that sphere of space-time will contain air molecules. Air molecules contain atoms. Atoms contain electrons. So that material stress, that mechanical stress, would cause the electrons to jump up into higher and higher orbits from that mechanical excitement. So the first thing we would see, Dr. Marra, is an electromagnetic field that would appear out of nowhere. It would just appear out of thin air. And lo and behold, when paranormal investigators take EMF meters into haunted sites, they see this very same thing. Electromagnetic fields that appear out of nowhere. And as a sidebar on this is why when people say spirit energy, I say I disagree with that statement. It's an oxymoron. It's like saying honest politician. And it's one of the concepts that messes our minds up. It's one of those false paradigms that we get stuck in, and it's like a rut because we're trying to mix both superphysical and physical elements into some sort of a physical image, and it doesn't work. It's like trying to make the cart and a horse the same thing. The information that's coming down and materializing inside of one of these bubbles is what I would call, quote-unquote, the spirit or the entity or whatever you'd want to call it. But the effect, the environment, which is being created that causes that information to occur inside of it is what generates the energy. The energy exists on our physical plane and remains there. So there's no such thing as spirit energy. There's spirit and there's energy. This is one of the things about getting an education, because energy is physical.
Okay.
But, and again, when we look at the paranormal, we sometimes get kind of confused, and we think, well, this is so abnormal that everything about it must be abnormal. So anyway, one of the things that, with electrons, what goes up must come down. So they get excited, they come back down, and fall back into their lower orbits. One of the things that electrons can do when they drop back down is they can emit photons, particles of light. We know this physical effect. It's very well known. In fact, we have technology today all around us that makes use of this effect. You pass an electromagnetic field through a physical material. You excite its electrons. The electrons fall back down. They emit photons. That's what's called a light-emitting diode. And so here we have a ball of space-time jacketed in an electromagnetic field and emitting photons under certain conditions. And I've just given the world's first scientific model of what paranormal investigators call a luminous orb.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Okay.
exactly what it is.
All right, so I hate to keep popping around here, but just as these questions pop up, as you're talking about energy, so some of us that do energy healing and do distance healing, and it appears to work, and you had mentioned non-locational. Can you explain, is it possible, could your theory explain how distance healing works? I guess is the best way I could say it.
Well, yeah, sure. But when you're talking about distance healing, first of all, are we really talking about the generation of a remote energy field? Do we know that? Here, I'll give you the example of what I'm talking about. Let's look at it from a different way, where we actually have a picture of coherent information that we can kind of look at and understand and recognize. Let's take remote viewing, for example, because that is a quote-unquote parapsychological effect at a distance. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, absolutely.
Remote viewing? Okay, let's take a look at this. Now, let's say somebody remote views a site. They're on the East Coast. They remote view a site in California, for example. Maybe they see a 57 Chevy in that picture. And it's so detailed they can tell the geometry of the car, maybe even the color of it. All of this is information. It's just like if you had a photograph of that and you stored it on your hard drive, it doesn't exist in the form of a photograph. It exists in forms of ones and zeros, magnetically stored, that even if we were able to detect them on this magnetic platter, we could pull the hard drive apart, we still can't see it. We might be able to detect them magnetically, but we wouldn't be able to recognize the ones and zeros and as anything coherent unless we had a mechanism, a device that could translate it for us. So let's take a look at the information on that remote site, the red 57 Chevy, as a collection of information. Now that information is transmitted in some way. It's conveyed in some way to the remote viewer. We've done experiments with Faraday cages. that we know that there is no radiation serving as a carrier wave of that information to that recipient. All right? It's like we're talking on the telephone. There are actually radiation waves that are carrying the information of my voice through the airwaves to a receiver somewhere on your end. You know, through the satellites and the towers and even through the copper and optical wires. That doesn't happen in remote viewing. So that information not only is being conveyed superphysically, extraphysically, it's not being conveyed through any physical medium, but it also is being able to be stored extraphysically intact. In other words, if this information is originating from above space and time, it's able to maintain its coherence and recognizable forms through that superphysical realm and through its reemergence in the physical reality at the sight of the recipient. Now, it enters into the recipient's mind, into the human brain, and that becomes an arena for the materialization of that information. As soon as that remote scene enters into the brain materializes the electrochemical components of it. And I know, Dr. Marra, you being, educated in the medical field, you understand what I'm talking about with this electrochemical component of thought. But the actual configuration of that electrochemical pattern does not exist in the brain until the remote viewed information enters into it, and then that particular form or that configuration of that electrochemical pattern emerges and materializes in the human brain based on the information that it's receiving. Now, once that information comes down into the arena of the human brain, that's where the energy is being generated. If this information, Dr. Marra, is traveling to us superphysically, energy is physical. So the information can't be comprised of energy. This is why I say when we talk into the parapsychological field of energy, I want to emphasize the paradigm that the energy is not what the information is comprised of. The energy is a result of the effect of the information materializing into physical reality. That's where the energy is generated.
Okay. So I'm trying to wrap my head around this whole thing because you gave the example of the computer, the zeros and the ones. I understand. I get it. I see the brain as either a transmitter or a receiver. In the analogy that you're giving of the remote viewer, I can see that person is tuning in, so to speak, to a particular area on the planet within this dimension, but the information that's there may be, at least in my mind, I'm looking at it as though it's a vibration, maybe, a vibratory energy, like the color of the car is red, so that carries a certain vibration, which has a meaning, rather than the O's and the ones or the zeros and the ones that are for the computer. And it's how it's perceived and interpreted through the brain as it comes back through. And then we talked about the chemical reactions in the brain and so on and so forth. So that's kind of how I'm looking at it. And I don't know what you think of that as far as your theory goes.
Well, here's what it is. Again, you're looking at it from a materialistic paradigm. In other words, you're trying to express it in completely material terms. And I'll try to explain the distinction with what I'm talking about. Yes, color. Let's say the Chevy is red. That color is a function of radiation. And, of course, waves, you can look at them as vibrations, a frequency and amplitude. They're certainly vibrating the spatial field, which is how those waves are carried from one location to another. But what I'm saying is this, that those vibrations only exist on the physical plane, and they are created by the materialized information. Since we know that remote viewing can work inside of a Faraday cage, none of those vibrations you're talking about is conveying the information to the remote viewer. So that the information itself does not have vibration in the terms of a physical wavelength, because it exists outside of space-time, where frequency and amplitude would collapse into a singularity. This is what the problem, again, why we need to collaborate in different fields, why people in the medical field need to collaborate with physicists, and vice versa. So what you're talking about, when I say materialized information, the 57 Chevy is materialized information. When that materialized information finally exists in our space-time, that's when it radiates waves. But the information itself is stored outside of space-time, independently of the physical constituent. Just like the remote viewing information is stored outside of space-time, independently of the brain. It's only when that thought enters into the brain that the radiation is generated in the form of an electrochemical apparition, if you will, of a body of that information, physical, in the brain. So, although everything you're saying right about the vibrations of the radiation reflecting from and off that 57 Chevy, that information isn't transmitted to the remote viewer in that form.
Right. Okay,
it's not big.
Okay, that's okay. I'm just trying to get this information out there in a way that we all can understand it. And I just have a couple things to add to this, just to kind of bring it home, so to speak. If you could, I
appreciate that very much. Your questions are very, very useful in bringing the aspects of this theory forth. I do appreciate it.
Okay, because you mentioned the study in Einstein, so I want you to, if you can, explain E equals MC squared, because I think it really ties into what we're talking about right here, right now.
Okay, let's this is going to take a few minutes, folks. Let's go down the rabbit hole of the greatest mind that ever existed, Albert Einstein. Let's go down the rabbit hole with him a little bit. Take the blue pill. And here we go. Because we hear all about the different theories of Einstein, special theory of relativity, general theory of relativity, E equals MC squared. Nothing can exceed the speed of light. The bending of space-time around mass. We hear about all these things. But what we don't hear, and you have to read his writings to get down into this, is Einstein had a vision of reality. And all of these theories grew out of this primary vision. And the vision was this: that space is not an empty void like Einstein or like Newton claimed. Space is a substantial field. It is a continuous field. This is why it's called the space-time continuum. Now, what it means by this continuous field is that everything in the universe is comprised of this field, this one field. When it is materialized, when it is in the form of dimensional space-time, this field is defined by 4 independent variables, 3 spatial and 1 temporal. It exists, you can picture it like a fabric or like a sheet of rubber that he sometimes compared it to. Now, what he said was this: within that field, there would be areas of greater and lesser concentrations or densities. Now, when you have an area of densification of this field, it materializes into matter. It becomes what he called a matter point, or a physical component of the universe. But it still arose out of the very same spatial field that continues throughout the entire universe. Imagine here's a good way of thinking about it. Imagine let's say you had a flat tabletop, like a good solid flat tabletop that was like Formica or something, a laminate, nice and flat. And let's say you went outside and took pebbles of sand and you placed them randomly on that tabletop. Now let's take a sheet of plastic, let's say clear plastic, something like a plastic wrap, but something that can be vacuum formed and hardened. And take that sheet, place it on top of your table with the pebbles, vacuum form it so you suck all the air out from under it, and then harden it, and then pick it up in the air and take a look at it. That's Einsteinian space-time. So what Einstein said was this. He said that matter and energy are two forms of the same thing. This was an incredible, mind-blowing, paradigm-changing, earth-shattering concept that grew out of his vision of reality. That matter and energy have to be two forms of the same thing because both of them are emergence of the spatial field of space. They're a continuum of the flat field of space where it's not concentrated, where it's more diffuse. So this is where E equals MC squared comes from. Now, Einstein also said is that the upper level of these four individual characteristics that define the spatial field of the universe, 3 spatial and 1 temporal, height, width, depth, and time, that they would converge at the speed of light. That above the speed of light, they would turn into negative numbers and singularities. This is why he said nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. It's been proved over and over and over and over and over again. And even this experiment where they found neutrinos traveling faster than light, that experiment has since been discredited. So here we have energy equals matter, which is a very concentrated and tiny form of energy. It's very highly compact, times the speed of light squared. And that has to do, the speed of light squared has to do with the 4-dimensional geometry of space. It's not a single dimension. It's multidimensional. And so this is where the constant is squared. So matter, or energy equals matter times the speed of light, the constant of the universe, squared, multiplied by itself. This is E equals MC squared. This is the concept behind the continuous field from which everything in the physical universe arises and is just different forms of this same field. Was that a good explanation of that, Doctor?
Absolutely. And my point behind the whole thing was the coexistence of energy and matter in the same place and space. And I think that because of how we perceive things with our 5 senses, what we started out this conversation with, and how the brain interprets it is, or the limitation actually is what the best way I should say it. It may be coming from a higher dimension, some of it. Like the matter, obviously, we can perceive here with our eyes. We can touch it. And from a higher vantage point, it may be energy rather than the physicality or the matter. And that's the thing that I'm not real clear on yet, because I've heard so many theories. I've been studying the string theory and even what you're saying tonight. So I think it's all related, and I think it was worth mentioning tonight, and to have you give us your take on it and explain at least Einstein's theory and how that relates to what your work is. And so maybe you could go with that a little bit.
Yes. Here's what my model is, and it's a good question. And we've given the background now, and people, give me a little bit of a, an open mind, so to speak, kind of put preconceptions aside and try to visualize what I'm saying. I talked about this hardened piece of clear plastic laying on the table, vacuum formed, so that when we pick it up, we can see these bubbles of space-time, these bends that surround the physical objects of these petals or these pebbles. This is looking at space-time from the dimensional side. This is how Einstein saw it. He was dealing strictly in what was physical. What I say is there's an extension to this. Take the sheet and imagine that we are going to shift our perceptions to what is above space-time, that's super physical. So take this hardened sheet and flip it over and look at the backside of it. Now, what do you see? What you see, you don't see any longer masses bending the space around them. And this is what's causing such a stir about my theory. If you flip it over and look at it from the other side, what you see are pockets of space-time in which masses are materialized. So rather than mass bending space, bent space actually creates a womb or a crucible, an environment in which mass densifies and materializes. This is why my theory eliminates a graviton. It eliminates the existence of dark matter, this strange, weird, bizarre substance that's supposed to generate 90% of the gravity in the universe, but is undetectable by any means. When you really think about it, if someone outside of physics thought of that, they would call him a quack. It eliminates supersymmetry. It eliminates mirrored charges. All these strange devices that modern physicists come up with in their theories that Einstein would have called unnecessary complexity are all arising from trying to shoehorn that which is both physical and superphysical into a strictly physical paradigm. So when you flip that sheet of plastic over, you are now seeing my theory of supergeometrics. It's an extension of Einsteinian space.
Right. Yeah, great. So go ahead.
This brings us back to the haunted house, Dr. Marra.
Yeah.
So here we have a bubble of space-time that opens up. It generates an electromagnetic field on its surface, and it produces an environment in which information can drop down and materialize. So you have someone who lived 100 years ago in a house and died. Their physical materialization disappeared, but the information from which they were comprised still exists outside of space-time. That information has actually traveled through to the future, drops down into our local environment, and rematerializes in front of us as an apparition.
I have something interesting to say right now, and it's really this is all going to tie in. I just want to hear your take on it. You said 100 years, right? So
yeah, I just picked out something arbitrary from the sky,
perfect. It's perfect. It's perfect because we're talking about the 3 dimension, actually 4 with the time. And
yes.
Okay, a friend of mine and I were in New York, and she's a channeler. And all of a sudden she starts channeling this individual. And I'm not going to go through the whole story for the sake of time, but basically when she channeled this individual, they come out and they're speaking to me. And to make a long story short, they were looking for their families, and they had died 100 years ago. And basically I said, well, what year is it there? And they're like, well, it was 1908. And this was in 2008. And I'm like, oh, my gosh, you've been stuck in this area for 100 years. And I said, do you know that it's 2008? And they're like, no, I didn't. I said, well, how long ago did it seem like you died? And they said, just now. Their response was just like, because there is no sense of time on the other side, though at least that's what we've all been told. And that example, to me, and personally experiencing it, made sense to me. So what is your thought with that experience?
Well, given that your testimony is true, and I'm giving that, we always have to consider that, but given that your testimony is true, this is my very evidence to say that there is no such thing as spirit energy, because energy is physical. Energy comprises of frequency and amplitude. It's a wave function. And frequency is time, and amplitude is spatial. And so if this person was stored in the form of energy, he would have underwent time, because energy has a frequency, and that's a measure of time. The only way that intelligent collection of information could still be talking to us from the past into the present is if that information is being stored non-physically. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I brought it up for, because it all made sense to me.
This is the first model. I've had so many people tell me this is the first model in the history of this field that actually starts drawing everything together: physics, religion, parapsychology, paranormal, ufology, and starts bringing it together under a single cosmology with a single model that explains all of it.
Yeah, you know what? We have a caller. Would you like to take a call?
Sure. Hey, I didn't even talk about anybody's dead Aunt Mary. That's good.
Well, let me see if I can bring this person on here real quick. Okay, caller, welcome to A Guiding Light, and your area code is 661. Do you have a question for Thomas? Caller with area code 661, welcome to A Guiding Light. Do you have a question? Well, I guess they don't have a question. They must be just hanging on the line here.
Well, maybe they're having technical difficulties. Maybe they might try calling back, Doctor.
Okay, so I'm going to put it in. The guest call-in number is 323-679-0927. And if you have a question for Mr. Fusco, please call in. So go ahead and get back to what you were heading down the road. I'm sorry I popped in with that example, but I thought it was important to give some personal experience with what you were saying so that it would make a little more sense.
Yeah. Let's take a look now. Doctor, you've read about the physical idea of teleportation. You know all about that. They talk about like Star Trek, okay, where they have this computer that's so incredibly powerful that they can break up the body into its individual constituents and transmit it to another location in such an informational rich signal that every component of that, that beamed person can be reassembled correctly. I would say that that's pretty much impossible to do. But now, think about this way. Think about it according to my model, which is an extension of Einstein's. What if we were able to collapse the bubble of space-time that surrounds a physical object? If we were able to collapse that bubble, Doctor, as it collapsed, the object would begin to lose its physical presence in space-time. It would become thinner, more ethereal. It could even become transparent at some point. The effect of local gravity would be so greatly diminished at some point on it that it would begin to float. It might be so ethereal that it could pass through other solid objects like a wall. Starting to sound like a ghost, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Hey, your caller called back in here.
Hey, all right. He must have Aunt Mary then. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm being silly.
No, that's okay. Let me just see if I can get him or her on the line here.
Okay.
All right. Caller with the area code 661. Welcome to A Guiding Light. Do you have a question? Do you have a question for Mr. Fusco, please? Okay, I don't know what the issue is on there, so I guess we're going to have to keep going with it.
Yeah, I mean, from my end, I heard some sort of a static of some sort.
Yeah.
It sounded like somebody was trying to say something, but...
Yes, I heard it. It just isn't coming through, so I don't know if it's on their end or... Obviously, we heard it, so I don't know. So maybe you can go ahead and I'll just keep checking the switchboard here.
Okay, we don't. This BTR doesn't have a chat room for you, does it? Does it?
There is a chat room actually, and I haven't used it up to this point.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, let's see. Let's try to go a little bit further in this paranormal thing, because what's important, Doctor, again, is what my model does. It makes certain predictions. I've talked about some of them, that this model predicts there is no such thing as a graviton. There's no such thing as dark matter. In fact, what's really exciting, because I've taken a lot of heat in my field, Doctor, about saying there's no such thing as dark matter. I've had a lot of stones thrown to me about that. But recently, just in the last month, astrophysicists have completed a survey of our local region of space, solar system, and some neighboring stars. Based on their calculations and the theory of dark matter, they made a prediction that when they completed the survey, they would find a volume of mass that was invisible, approximately the same mass as the Earth. Well, they completed their survey, and they found nothing. No dark matter. And, boy, when I heard that, I jumped up and down. I told you so. I've been telling you for years. There's no such thing as supersymmetry. This is another thing I predict. And it's funny that one of the first things that the CERN collider, the Large Hadron Collider, was supposed to find was supersymmetrical particles, because they were supposed to be the easiest to find at the giga-electron volts that the accelerator runs. They found none. They still haven't found any. And here's the problem. They're looking for that Higgs boson, which I say that the Higgs field doesn't exist, that mass is not created by a field of a particle. Mass is created by the bending of space. And so one of the problems that they have is their theory about the Higgs boson, which gives off a field that's supposed to have given other particles mass, is that without supersymmetrical particles, the theory projects the Higgs field with an infinite value, which is physically impossible. So this is getting very exciting. But if we go a step further, if we go back into the haunted house, and we're talking about materializing information, let's think about a materialized vocalization. Let's say a disembodied or a non-materialized, an unmaterialized, coherent, intelligent collection of information attempts to speak. And speech itself, of course, is a collection of information. It's a coherent, orderly, recognizable pattern of information. And imagine this supergeometric pattern, which is what I call them in my book. It's a theory of supergeometrics. Begins to materialize in this bubble, this orb that I was talking about. Well, as it materializes, the bubble begins to take on the shape and form of the materialized information. So like when we see an apparition that's very detailed, we can recognize it as a person. The bending of space around that apparition has configured itself to that exact geometry with all its hundreds of thousands of angles and surfaces. So if we have a vocal information that's materializing, the surface of the bubble will take the form of that materialized information, which will begin to vibrate the surface of that bubble according to the frequency and the amplitude of that materializing information. Now, what happens then? It begins to set up a compression wave in the surrounding air molecules. And so suddenly, we hear a disembodied voice. We hear a voice coming out of midair because the actual spatial field is vibrating like a speaker. It's actually coming off of the surface of space. And this would perfectly explain disembodied voices.
Right. So how do you explain the... Now I can get behind all this. It's just the sound vibration is coming through so that our eardrums it vibrates and we actually hear it. But what about the why can our brains or our eyes cannot perceive, or just doesn't it manifest the visual part of it?
Oh, it can. It does.
Oh, okay.
Whenever we see a visible paranormal phenomenon, that phenomenon is presenting a surface that reflects or emits photons.
Right.
That's how we see an apparition. Because, again, it's that thing, physics. You know, we human beings, we take it for granted that we can see. Human beings are blind. We can't see a thing. We have no human being that ever lived ever saw a physical object from the history of humanity. What we see is photons reflected or emitted from those surfaces. That's the only thing we can see. So anytime we see an apparition, that's what we're seeing. We see a luminous phenomena either in an orb or a luminous effect within ufology. We're seeing photons. So we do see them. But, of course, under normal circumstances, we don't see a normal voice. We're not going to see a paranormal voice either.
Right. Okay, so some of the tools that are used are heat-sensitive cameras that the information is picked up via the camera, but the human being can't see it at that time. And the same with the recordings that they actually record. Maybe they're more sensitive to the information that's coming across at the particular time, or the person's brain or their filter or the antenna or however the receiver, I guess is a better way to put it, is not as sensitive as the equipment that we're using sometimes.
Well, this is where it gets really, really cool, Dr. Marra. This is where this theory is really beginning to blow people's minds. Because remember what I said earlier about the falling electrons within the electromagnetic field. Now, one of the things that every electromagnetic field generates is heat. But there are circumstances where electrons themselves can emit additional heat in releasing this mechanical energy when they fall back down into their lower orbits. So, yes, some of these spectrums of radiation, of light radiation, we need one of these thermal imaging cameras to see. But here's the crazy thing about it. When we look at a normal thermal signature of a living person, we see great contrasts of the heat signatures. We see, places on the face are much hotter compared to the tips of the ears, to the clothing, to the hair, et cetera, et cetera. But when we take a look at these thermal images, we find that their thermal signature is more or less uniform across the entire image. This is something that's never been noticed before. It wasn't looked for until my theory came along. And then they look at the evidence and say, oh, my goodness, this guy Fusco's right. We have this uniform heat signature more or less across the entire surface. That means, number one, the same heat-generating mechanism is occurring across the entire image, not like a human being. And number two, the effect is happening at the surface. It's not happening in the core. There is no human body inside that apparition. The heat, the energy is being generated at the surface in a uniform way, and that's what gives these paranormal thermal images. They're very odd, kind of a look. Now let's talk about EVPs. We were just talking about the vibration of air columns, of air molecules, with this surface of this bubble. Let's take this same materializing information in this bubble, but let's say that we're at a lower energy level where it's not sufficiently intense to agitate the physical air molecules. But what it is doing, it is oscillating. Remember I talked about the electromagnetic field that jackets these bubbles. It's oscillating that electromagnetic field. Now that field has a limited range, but it is setting off a compression wave, an electromagnetic compression wave. Now let's move to a second and look at a conventional microphone. A microphone has an acoustic diaphragm, which is agitated by the excitement or the compression wave in the air of that medium, which vibrates the acoustic diaphragm. The diaphragm is connected to copper coils. The copper coils pass through a surrounding magnet. So the acoustic membrane vibrates. It vibrates the copper coils. The copper coils pass back and forth through the magnet and set up an electromagnetic compression field of a given frequency and amplitude, which is transferred into the electronics and converted into a voice. This is how a recorder works and a microphone works. Our ears do the same thing with acoustic sound through the tympanic membrane and the bones in there. I forget all the names. You know them. But it sends an electromagnetic signal to the brain that can interpret it as sound. Same kind of a thing. Now, we have this propagating electromagnetic compression wave of a frequency and an amplitude reflected by the materializing vocalization. It travels to the microphone. It bypasses the acoustic membrane because it's not an acoustical compression wave, it's an electromagnetic wave. It induces itself directly on the copper coils. The copper coils no longer need to move through the magnet back and forth to set up an electromagnetic compression wave. The wave already exists. It just induces itself on the coils, goes into the electronics, translated in a voice, and here we have an EVP recorded where everyone standing around the microphone heard nothing because it was not an acoustical compression wave, it was an electromagnetic wave. The predictions that this makes is we should be able to conduct 3 different experiments. Number 1, we should be able to do put a recorder in a vacuum bell and completely evacuate the air out of it so no acoustical compression wave can reach it and still record an EVP. B, that we should be able to surgically remove the acoustic diaphragm from a microphone and still record an EVP. And 3, we should not be able to record an EVP with a cardioid mic, which works different than these coil microphones. All 3 experiments have already been conducted and verified that this model is correct.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay.
I've been working so hard to publicize the work of myself and my collaborative associate David Roundtree. We are trying to get out this information to the world that we have advanced the study of paranormal phenomena. And again, I'm not being arrogant. I'm trying to state this strongly so people get it, that we are as far ahead of the standard mainstream model of the paranormal as Newton was from Aristotle.
Right. Okay, so I have a question that just popped into my head.
Okay, great. Maybe it's remote viewed from that caller.
Could be.
That would be really cool.
maybe you can explain some of the people that claim they've had paranormal experiences where the television is turning off and on, off and on. All of a sudden they pull the plug, and now it still keeps turning off and on.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, aren't we talking about the generation of an electromagnetic field?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. There you go.
Right.
Yeah. Why not?
Yeah.
You know, these, I mean, we plug it into a wall, but today's televisions run on very, very little electricity. Even the recent cathode ray tubes, you know, they're all integrated circuit. You know, so, and remember another thing, that as far as the high voltage, you know that the television has capacitors in it that stay charged for 24 to 48 hours. This is why if you ever worked on televisions, they tell you be careful where you stick that screwdriver, because you hit one of those capacitors, you know, what they used to call a rectifier years ago, it'll knock you on your butt. It'll shoot you across the room. You could get knocked out by it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, this is the answer to how these electromagnetic fields seem to propagate out of thin air, because according to this model, this gives us an explanation as to how electromagnetic fields are literally propagating out of thin air.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll tell you what, this is an awesome discussion. We got like a little less than 15 minutes left here. So I want to give you the opportunity to talk about your website, your book, and maybe promote that and the other people that you were talking about. Yeah,
and of course, my work is very universal. In other words, I address the universe as a whole and the way that it's put together. And then I relate it to these various fields, you know, traditional religious beliefs and concepts as personified or embodied in the Bible. I talk about things like we were talking about with cosmology, astronomy, chemistry, particle physics. I even talk about evolution and, of course, the nature of human consciousness. All of this relates together. And the book also talks about possible fantastic possibilities. That, for example, one of the relationships that has been noticed for a long time, and you'll appreciate this, Doctor, is that people have noticed the parallels between haunted phenomena and UFO phenomena. There's a number of characteristics that are virtually identical.
Right.
So what I propose is that the paranormal phenomena, which has been happening, of course, for thousands of years, and it's a natural process. It's got something to do with the way the universe is assembled. There has to be a science behind it, which I'm describing the beginning parts of it in my book. I believe that if UFOs are intelligently controlled craft, that the designers of these craft have discovered the laws of physics that pertain to paranormal phenomena in a haunted house and have built technology based on those principles.
Right.
And it would do everything. It would produce everything that we see in haunted sites with a UFO. Incredible acceleration with no visible means of propulsion, a.k.a. poltergeist activity. You know, they change shapes. They duplicate themselves. You know.
I got one for you. One just popped into my head. What about, like, free energy?
Well, there you go. You know, I mean, if we can induce these effects, again, this is the issue that we run into with a lot of paranormal phenomena and UFO observations, that we see no visible means of propulsion. So they are obviously incorporating energy in a way that we're unfamiliar with. And, of course, these phenomena, according to my model, the very bending of space produces an electromagnetic field. And so that electromagnetic field can also be tapped in on. Plus, it would eliminate the need for energy in a lot of instances. For example, let's take Einstein's model again of the fabric of space-time as a rubber sheet. Take a rubber sheet, stretch it across the frame, and let's say we stand it up on 4 legs like a table. And so a tight rubber sheet is the tabletop. This is the fabric of space-time. Let's take a baseball and place it on it. And that creates a divot in the rubber sheet. It creates a bend in space. Remember that model I was talking about with the hardened plastic sheet with the pebbles that made the bubbles, and you pick it up and look at it? This is the same kind of thing. Now, let's take our hand and push the baseball to move it. We not only have the weight of the baseball to overcome, but we're also pushing against the fabric of space itself. It takes a certain amount of energy and a physical structure to house and direct that energy, i.e. our arm and hand, to push that baseball across that fabric, that rubber. Now let's look at it in another way. Let's say the underneath of the table is this super physical realm I'm talking about. And let's say we get how would I say it? This is an imperfect metaphor, but let's say our fingers represent the mechanism by which we could artificially bend time. And reach our hand under the table and grab the rubber that's in front of the ball and pull it down and create a pocket. What's the ball do? Rolls right into the pocket. No means of propulsion. Now, as the ball is rolling into the pocket, let's say we're able to start sliding the pocket forward, and the ball follows it. If you do it fast enough, the ball gets caught up on the outer lip, the edge of that bubble, and gets pushed along by this progressing bubble of space-time that's advancing in front of the spacecraft. So what it actually does is the baseball rides the edge of the bubble like a surfer rides a wave. It's beautiful. Right. And what's cool about it, even more so, is that this extra bubble that we're pulling down is a separate relative zone of space-time than the area of space-time that occupies the inside of the baseball. So while the pocket on the outside is encountering inertial and aerodynamic resistances around it, the bubble inside of the baseball experiences none of this. So it could move at 3,000 miles an hour and take a right angle, and the people inside are sitting perfectly still because they're isolated from the inertial forces that are undergoing around the outside of the other realm of space-time that they're sitting in. It's gorgeous.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm amazed that the men in black haven't knocked on my door yet.
I was going to ask you, that was my next question. Have you had threats about this? Because when you start...
No.
Okay.
No, I hesitate. I speak on some shows, Dr. Marra, where we have hosts and callers who are very serious subscribers to some of this stuff. And I believe that on some level it does happen. I just don't believe it happens on the level that, that people think.
Okay.
It's like, if the aliens were sending me signals to try to make me stupid, or chemtrails were being pumped into my house to make my brain not work, how did I come up with this theory? How did I write my book? How are they letting us talk on the telephone? Couldn't they just shut off the line?
Yeah, right.
Oh, I understand. That must have been the caller. He was the guy that had the secret CIA information. That's why they shut him off.
That's it. He was cut out. We tried.
Yeah, and I'm not being sarcastic to all of this. Anytime you have a government, you're going to have conspiracies. One of the jobs of government is to promote the domestic tranquility. So they have to keep some things secret.
Right.
There's things I don't want to know. People ask me about, the doctor, they ask me about, well, what do you think of Area 51? And what do you think of, crashed UFOs and that our government has reversed engineered, this technology? And I kind of rain on their parade. Said, you know what? I don't want to know. And furthermore, I don't want you to know. And furthermore, I don't want the guy in the other country to know. I don't want anybody to know. You know when I want them to know? When our enemies try to kill us and we get into such a trouble that we open up our hangars and we pull up all kinds of alien whip butt that no one ever heard about before, and when that alien whip butt is 3 inches from that terrorist's butt, ready to atomize him, that's when I want him to know what we have.
All right.
You see what I mean?
Oh, I hear what you're saying.
So all these people digging into these secrets, I think, man, do you really, really, really want to know this? Really?
Well,
and if you did know it, what you going to do about it?
It's kind of like your theories of what you're talking about. People want to know. We're curious. We want to know what's going on, and that's what we're doing the show about. I know there's lots of listeners that want to know how the universe works and, what's true, what's not. And basically we're looking for the truth here. So, of course, everybody's got their own opinions. And I love your theory. And, it was a great discussion tonight. So I just want to thank you for being on the show. We have only like a couple minutes left here. And I wanted to give you the opportunity to give out your website and your contact information.
I got distracted. I got on that UFO when I was talking about this earlier. But just to add everything, just to add a countermeasure, so to speak, to what I just said, according to my theory, it would be unthinkable that there isn't intelligent life elsewhere in the universe, and that a science exists that could get that intelligence here if they wanted to and understood it. So I just wanted to say that also.
Awesome.
My site, where you can get the book, find out about the book. There's a contact email for me. The caller could definitely email me at this, www.cosmicveil, V-E-I-L, cosmicveil.com.
Okay. And is there anything you'd like to leave our listeners with? Final word.
Well, final word is this. When we understand that we truly are much more than just intelligent animals, that there is truly something in us that's much higher than all that, that I hope that we can learn as a species to treat ourselves and each other accordingly with that same reverence and respect that who and what we really are should command.
Awesome. All right. Thank you again for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, Doctor. I appreciate the time.
All right. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
All right. There you have it. Thomas Fusco. Go to his website. Check out his book. And, again, we want to thank him for being on the show. I wanted to put another shout out to all the fathers out there to a happy Father's Day. And next week, Sunday, June 24th, we have Norma Hollis. Norma and I will be discussing the possibility of healing the body, relationships, and even money. Norma may just have a prescription for your life transformation. So tune in as we discuss the possibilities. And I'm Dr. Marra, signing off.